The gunshot that shattered the morning silence outside the Denver bank was the last sound Florence Garrison heard before her world changed forever. Her husband crumpling to the boardwalk while clutching the deposit bag he had promised to deliver safely. She stood frozen in her widow's black 3 months later on a December morning in 1876, watching the Rocky Mountains disappear behind her as the Union Pacific train carried her away from everything she had known, away from the sympathetic glances and whispered pity, away from the life that had been stolen in an instant by a bullet meant for money that was not even theirs. The railway car swayed and creaked as it climbed through the Sierra Nevada, and Florence pressed her gloved hand against the cold window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the landscape transform from brown plains to pine forests now dusted with early winter snow. She had received the letter from her aunt in Marysville, California, 2 weeks after the funeral, an invitation extended with careful words about fresh starts and healing, about how the gold rush town had settled into something quieter now, something respectable. Florence had packed her 2 trunks with the methodical precision of someone going through motions, folding her modest dresses and the few pieces of jewelry her husband Thomas had given her during their brief 2 years of marriage. She was 23 years old and felt ancient, as though grief had aged her beyond her years, stealing the lightness she had once carried so easily. The train lurched as it began its descent toward the Sacramento Valley, and Florence gathered her carpetbag, checking that her ticket and the address of her aunt's boarding house were still tucked safely in the inner pocket. Through the window, she could see snow beginning to fall, light flurries that caught the afternoon light and swirled in the wind created by the train's passage. It seemed fitting somehow, this quiet snow in a land she had heard rarely saw it, as though nature itself was marking this moment of transition. When the train finally ground to a halt at the Marysville station, Florence stood on shaking legs and made her way to the exit. The conductor, a kind-faced man with silver mutton chops, helped her down the steep steps. "Watch yourself, miss," he said, though she still wore her wedding ring and he should have said Mrs. "Snow's making things slippery." Florence stepped onto the platform alone, her boots touching down on wood that was indeed slick with a thin layer of white. The snow fell harder now, fat flakes that landed on her black bonnet and the shoulders of her traveling coat. She set down her carpetbag and looked around, searching for her aunt's face among the small crowd gathered to meet the afternoon train. "Florence." The voice came from her left, and she turned to see a man standing apart from the others, leaning against a post with his hat pulled low against the snow. He was tall and lean, dressed in worn denim trousers and a heavy canvas coat, with a red bandana tied at his throat. As he pushed away from the post and walked toward her, she could see his face more clearly, the strong jaw shadowed with several days of stubble, the striking blue eyes that seemed to see straight through her careful composure. "I am sorry, do I know you?" Florence asked, her voice steady despite the flutter of uncertainty in her chest. The cowboy stopped a few feet away, and something in his expression made her breath catch. It was not aggression or impropriety, but rather a strange mixture of relief and recognition, as though he had been waiting for something and had just found it. "No, madam, you do not know me," he said, his voice rough and low, carrying the faint drawl of someone who had spent time in Texas or Oklahoma territories. "But I knew you would come. I felt it." Florence stared at him, uncertain whether to be alarmed or simply confused. "I beg your pardon." The cowboy seemed to realize how his words must have sounded, and he removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. "My name is Xavier Dalton, madam. I work at the Triple Bar Ranch about 5 miles outside town. Your aunt, Mrs." Catherine Murphy. She runs the boarding house on 2nd Street. Asked me to meet you here. She is tending to old Mr. Brennan, who took poorly this morning, and she did not want you arriving with no one to greet you." Relief washed through Florence, though it was tinged with lingering confusion about his strange greeting. "I see. Thank you, Mr. Dalton. I appreciate you taking the time. It is no trouble at all." Xavier replaced his hat and bent to pick up her carpet bag. "I've got a wagon just across the way. We should get you out of this snow. It does not usually come down this heavy in these parts." Florence followed him through the falling snow, noting the easy way he moved, the confidence of someone completely at home in his own skin. The wagon was indeed waiting, a sturdy buckboard with a pair of horses stamping their feet and blowing clouds of steam into the cold air. Xavier secured her carpetbag in the back, and then turned to help her up onto the seat, his hand strong and steady as she placed her gloved fingers in his palm. Once he had climbed up beside her and gathered the reins, he glanced at her with an expression she could not quite read. "I hope I did not frighten you with what I said back there. Sometimes words come out wrong when a man is nervous." "Nervous?" Florence pulled her coat more tightly around herself as the wagon began to move, the wheels crunching through the thin layer of snow. "Why would you be nervous about meeting a train?" Xavier was quiet for a long moment, his attention seemingly fixed on guiding the horses through Marysville's Main Street. The town was larger than Florence had expected, with brick buildings lining the thoroughfare, their windows glowing with lamplight as the early winter dusk gathered. She could see a general store, a bank, a hotel called the Golden West, and several saloons from which piano music drifted. "I suppose," Xavier finally said, "because I have been thinking about you for weeks now, ever since your aunt mentioned you were coming. She spoke of you often, of what you had been through, and I found myself hoping you would be someone strong enough to survive such loss, someone brave enough to start over." Florence turned to look at him fully, studying his profile in the fading light. There was something raw and honest in his words that touched her, even as part of her wanted to retreat behind the protective wall she had built around her heart. "You do not know anything about me, Mr. Dalton. I know you got on that train," he said softly. "I know you chose to keep moving when it would have been easier to stay where you were and let grief swallow you whole. That tells me something about who you are." They rode in silence for several minutes, the snow continuing to fall around them like a blessing or a veil separating them from the ordinary world. Florence found herself stealing glances at this strange cowboy who spoke to her as though he understood things she had not voiced, who looked at her not with pity, but with something that felt dangerously close to admiration. "How long have you worked at the Triple Bar?" she asked, needing to break the weighted silence. "About 7 years now. I came out here in 1869, right after the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. I was 18 and stupid and thought I would make my fortune in the gold fields." A smile touched his lips, transforming his serious face. "Turns out I was better with cattle than with a pickaxe. The Triple Bar took me on as a ranch hand, and I have been there ever since, working my way up to foreman. That is quite an accomplishment for someone your age." Florence did the quick calculation in her head. He would be 25 now, only 2 years older than herself. "Age does not mean much out here," Xavier said. "What matters is whether you can do the work and whether folks can trust you. I learned that fast enough." The wagon turned onto 2nd Street, and Xavier pulled the horses to a stop in front of a 2-story wooden house, painted a cheerful yellow that seemed to glow even in the gathering darkness. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys, and warm light spilled from several windows. A sign hanging from the porch read, "Murphy's Boarding House Clean Rooms, Good Meals." Before Florence could move, Xavier had jumped down and come around to her side, reaching up to help her descend. His hands bracketed her waist as he lifted her down, and for just a moment, they stood close enough that she could smell leather and pine and something else, something distinctly male that made her pulse quicken despite herself. "Thank you for the ride, Mr. Dalton," she managed, stepping back quickly. "Xavier," he corrected, retrieving her carpet bag from the wagon bed. "Mr. Dalton was my father and he has been dead these 10 years. Then you must call me Florence." He smiled at her, a real smile that reached his eyes and made her realize how handsome he was beneath the rough exterior. "Florence," he repeated, as though testing the name. "It suits you." Before she could respond, the boarding house door flew open and a stout woman in her 50s came bustling out, her arms already extended. "Florence, my dear girl, you are finally here. Come in out of this dreadful snow." Florence found herself enveloped in her Aunt Catherine's embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender water and bread dough. When she finally pulled back, she was surprised to find her eyes stinging with tears. Her aunt's round face creased with concern, and she patted Florence's cheek with a work-roughened hand. "There now, you are safe here. Xavier, bring that bag right on in. I have got her room all ready, the one at the front with the window seat." Catherine took Florence's arm and began steering her toward the warmth of the house. "I am sorry I could not meet you myself, but old Brennan had one of his spells and needed tending. Was Xavier kind to you?" "Very kind," Florence said, glancing back to see Xavier following with her luggage, snow dusting his broad shoulders. Inside, the boarding house was as welcoming as it had appeared from the street, with warm wooden floors scattered with braided rugs, walls papered in a cheerful floral pattern, and furniture that spoke of comfort rather than fashion. The scent of roasting chicken and fresh bread made Florence's stomach growl, reminding her that she had not eaten since early morning. "You must be starving," Catherine said, clearly having heard. "Supper will be ready in an hour. Let me show you to your room so you can freshen up. Xavier, be a dear and carry that bag upstairs." Florence followed her aunt up a narrow staircase, acutely aware of Xavier behind them. Her room was at the front of the house, just as Catherine had promised, with a large window that would look out over 2nd Street and a cushioned seat built beneath it. The furnishings were simple but clean. A brass bed covered with a white counterpane, a wardrobe, a washstand with a flowered basin and pitcher, and a small writing desk with a ladder-back chair. Xavier set her carpetbag down near the wardrobe and tipped his hat to both women. "I will be going now, Mrs. Murphy. Florence, it was a pleasure meeting you." "Will you not stay for supper, Xavier?" Catherine asked. "You know you are always welcome at my table." Something flickered across his face, but he shook his head. "Thank you kindly, but I need to get back to the ranch. We have got a mare about to foal, and I want to check on her before full dark." His eyes found Florence's. "Perhaps another time." "Perhaps," Florence heard herself say, and watched a slow smile spread across his face before he turned and left, his boots heavy on the stairs. Catherine closed the door and gave Florence a knowing look. "That Xavier is a good man. Best foreman the Triple Bar has ever had, according to Mr. Harrison, who owns the place. He has been saving his wages for years now, planning to buy his own spread one day." "Aunt Catherine, I only just met him," Florence protested, though she could feel heat rising in her cheeks. "I know that, dear. I am just saying." Catherine moved to the window and adjusted the curtains. "Now you take your time settling in. Fresh water is in the pitcher, and there are clean towels in the wardrobe. Supper is at 6, and we keep informal hours here. Most of my boarders are working men, respectable fellows from the mill and the freight company. They will be curious about you, but I will make sure they mind their manners." After her aunt left, Florence stood alone in the center of the room, listening to the sounds of the house around her. Footsteps on the floor below, the distant clatter of pots in the kitchen, the creak of the building settling. She removed her bonnet and coat, then went to the window and pushed aside the curtain. Snow was still falling, and the street below was beginning to accumulate a thin white covering. In the distance, she could just make out the shape of Xavier's wagon heading toward the edge of town, growing smaller until it disappeared into the snowy dusk. His words echoed in her mind. "I knew you would come. I felt it." It should have seemed presumptuous or strange, and yet there had been something in his eyes when he looked at her, a recognition that felt both unsettling and oddly comforting. As though he saw not just a grieving widow but the woman she might become, given time and space to heal. Florence turned away from the window and began unpacking her few belongings, trying not to think about blue eyes and strong hands, and the way her heart had quickened when Xavier had lifted her down from the wagon. She had loved Thomas, mourned him deeply, and the guilt of feeling even the smallest spark of interest in another man felt like a betrayal. And yet life continued, relentless and strange, bringing her to this gold-rush town in the snow, to this moment of standing at the threshold of something she could not yet name. Supper that evening was a lively affair despite Florence's emotional exhaustion. Catherine's boarding house held 6 permanent residents in addition to Florence: 3 men who worked at the lumber mill on the Yuba River, 2 clerks from the freight company, and an elderly gentleman named Mr. Patterson, who had been a prospector during the gold rush and now lived on his modest savings. All of them were polite to Florence, offering condolences for her loss and welcomes to Marysville with an earnestness that touched her. "Your aunt is the finest cook in Yuba County," Mr. Patterson declared, helping himself to a second serving of chicken and potatoes. "I have been eating at this table for 5 years now, and I have not had a bad meal yet." "You old flatterer," Catherine said, but she looked pleased. "Florence, you must eat more. You are too thin by half." Florence tried to comply, though her stomach was still unsettled from travel and emotion. The food was indeed excellent, hearty and flavorful, and she managed to finish most of what was on her plate. Around her, the boarders talked about their days, about the mill's production numbers and a shipment delayed by early snow in the mountain passes. It was ordinary conversation, the kind that had nothing to do with death or grief, and Florence found it soothing in its very mundanity. After supper, she helped her aunt clear the table despite Catherine's protests, needing something to do with her hands. In the kitchen, with its huge iron stove and scrubbed pine table, Catherine finally asked the question Florence had been dreading. "How are you really, dear? And please do not say you are fine." Florence set down the stack of plates she had been carrying and found that tears were suddenly streaming down her face, hot and unexpected. Catherine immediately wrapped her in another of those fierce embraces, and Florence let herself cry for the first time since leaving Denver, great shuddering sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside. "There now," Catherine murmured, stroking her hair. "Let it out, child. You have been holding yourself together too long." When the storm finally passed, Florence pulled back and accepted the clean handkerchief her aunt pressed into her hand. "I am sorry. Never apologize for grief. It has to go somewhere." Catherine guided her to a chair at the kitchen table and sat down across from her. "You loved Thomas. His death was a terrible tragedy, but you are young, Florence, with your whole life ahead of you. In time, you will find that you can hold both the sadness of what you lost and the joy of what might still come." "I do not know if I can love anyone else," Florence admitted, twisting the handkerchief between her fingers. "It feels wrong even to think about it." "I am not suggesting you should rush into anything. Lord knows you need time to heal. But when the right person comes along, do not shut the door just because you think it is too soon or it somehow dishonors Thomas's memory. He loved you. He would want you to be happy. Florence thought of Xavier's face as he had looked at her in the falling snow, the quiet certainty in his voice. She pushed the image away, not ready to examine what it meant. "How did you know?" she asked. "After Uncle James died, how did you know it was time to start living again?" Catherine was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant with memory. "I suppose I realized one day that I was laughing at something, really laughing, and it did not feel like a betrayal. It felt like coming back to myself, to the woman James had loved, the one who could find joy in simple things. That is when I knew he would be glad, wherever he was, that I had not buried myself along with him." They sat together in the warm kitchen while darkness fell completely outside and the snow continued its quiet descent. Eventually, Catherine rose and began heating water for washing up, and Florence helped her, falling into an easy rhythm of scrubbing and drying and putting away. By the time they finished, Florence felt wrung out but somehow lighter, as though the tears had released some of the pressure that had been building inside her chest for months. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed in the unfamiliar room, Florence listened to the sounds of Marysville settling into sleep. Horses passing in the street, distant voices from the saloons, the creak of the house around her. Through the window, she could see that the snow had stopped, leaving behind a world transformed into something clean and white and new. She closed her eyes and tried not to think about Xavier Dalton, about the way he had said her name as though it meant something. But as she drifted towards sleep, it was his face she saw, those blue eyes looking at her with a recognition that felt like coming home to a place she had never been. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the sun striking diamonds from the snow that covered Marysville's rooftops and streets. Florence woke to the sound of her aunt moving around downstairs and the smell of coffee and frying bacon. She dressed quickly in one of her morning dresses, then took extra time with her hair, pinning it up in a simple arrangement at the back of her head. Looking at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, she saw a woman who seemed younger than she felt, with large hazel eyes, a straight nose, and a mouth that had forgotten how to smile easily. Downstairs, she found Catherine in the kitchen preparing breakfast for the boarders, who would be coming down shortly before heading off to their various employments. Florence immediately set to helping, slicing bread and arranging it on platters, brewing fresh pots of coffee and tea. It felt good to be useful, to have her hands occupied with simple tasks. "I thought today you might like to see the town properly," Catherine said as she turned bacon in the huge skillet. "We can walk down to the main street, and I will introduce you to the shopkeepers. The general store is looking for someone to help with bookkeeping a few days a week, if you are interested in making a bit of money." "I would like that," Florence said. She had a small amount of savings from Thomas's life insurance, but it would not last forever, and she had no intention of being a burden on her aunt. They spent the morning making their rounds through Marysville's business district. Florence met Mr. Chen at the general store, a dignified Chinese merchant whose English was excellent and who indeed needed someone skilled with figures to help manage his growing inventory. She met Mrs. Holloway, who ran the dress shop and millinery, and Dr. Brennan, who had his practice in rooms above the pharmacy. Everyone was welcoming, and Florence began to understand that Catherine was well-liked and respected in the community, which reflected favorably on her niece. As they were leaving the post office, Florence spotted Xavier across the street, talking with another cowboy outside the feed store. He wore the same worn denim and canvas coat as the day before, but his hat was pushed back, revealing his face clearly in the bright morning light. Even from a distance, she could see the moment he noticed her, the way his body stilled and his attention focused entirely on her. He said something to his companion, then crossed the street with long strides, dodging a freight wagon and a woman carrying a basket of eggs. "Mrs. Murphy, Florence," he said when he reached them, touching the brim of his hat. "Fine morning after all that snow." "It is indeed," Catherine agreed. "How is that mare you were worried about?" She foaled around midnight. "A strong little colt, healthy as can be. Mr. Harrison is pleased." "I am glad to hear it." Catherine glanced between Xavier and Florence with barely concealed interest. "Well, I need to stop by the butcher's and place my order for next week. Florence, why do not you wait here where it is sunny? I will only be a few minutes." Before Florence could protest, her aunt had bustled off, leaving her alone with Xavier. "Your aunt is not exactly subtle," Xavier observed, amusement coloring his voice. "No, she is not," Florence agreed, feeling heat rise in her cheeks despite the cold air. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, and then Xavier said, "Would you walk with me? Just down to the river and back. There is something I would like to show you." Florence knew she should refuse, should maintain proper distance from this man she barely knew. But something in her, some part that had been frozen for months, wanted very much to say yes. "All right," she heard herself say, "but only for a few minutes. My aunt will worry." They walked side by side down 2nd Street toward the sound of rushing water. The Yuba River ran along the eastern edge of town, swollen with snowmelt from the mountains. When they reached the bank, Xavier led her to a spot where someone had built a rough bench from split logs. The view was spectacular. The water rushed past, white and wild, and beyond it, the snow-covered foothills rose toward the Sierra Nevada peaks gleaming in the distance. "I come here sometimes when I need to think," Xavier said, and Florence realized it was the first time she had heard him speak without being asked a direct question. "When I first came to California, I was running from something. My father had been a hard man, quick with his fists and his belt, and I could not wait to get away. I thought distance would fix what was broken inside me." Florence sat down on the bench, surprised by his honesty. Xavier remained standing, his gaze fixed on the mountains. "It took me a long time to understand that I was carrying my father with me, that all his anger and disappointment had become part of how I saw myself. Working at the Triple Bar, being around good men like Mr. Harrison and the other hands, that started to change things. I learned that I did not have to be what my father tried to make me. I could choose something different." He finally looked at her, and the vulnerability in his eyes made Florence's breath catch. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because yesterday when I saw you step off that train, you looked the way I felt back then. Like you were carrying something heavy that was not yours to carry. And I wanted you to know that it is possible to set it down, to be more than what happened to you." Tears pricked at Florence's eyes. "My husband was killed for a bag of money that was not even ours. He was just doing a favor for his employer and someone shot him for it. They never even caught the man who did it. How do I set that down?" Xavier moved to sit beside her on the bench, close but not touching. "You do not set it down all at once. You just start carrying it differently. You let other people help you hold the weight." They sat in silence, watching the river rush past, and Florence felt something shift inside her chest, a tiny crack in the wall she had built around her heart. Xavier made no move to touch her, said nothing more, just gave her the gift of his presence and his understanding. When Catherine's voice finally called from the street, they both stood, and Xavier walked Florence back to where her aunt waited with barely concealed curiosity. "Thank you," Florence said quietly, "for Xavier's ears only." "Any time," he replied, and something in his smile told her he meant it literally. The days that followed fell into a pleasant rhythm. Florence began working at Mr. Chen's general store 3 days a week, helping with inventory and bookkeeping. The work was satisfying, requiring enough concentration to keep her mind occupied but not so demanding that it left her exhausted. Mr. Chen was a patient employer who appreciated precision and did not mind her quiet nature. In the evenings, she helped her aunt with the boarding house, cooking and cleaning and making conversation with the residents. She began to recognize the patterns of Marysville life. The mill workers who returned home covered in sawdust, the freight wagons that rumbled through at predictable times, the church bells that marked the hours. And Xavier became a regular presence, though Florence suspected Catherine had something to do with the frequency of his visits. He would stop by in the evenings after his work at the Triple Bar was done, often bringing things the ranch did not need. Extra eggs from the chicken coop, vegetables from the kitchen garden, once even a side of beef that Mr. Harrison wanted to share. He would stay for supper, fitting easily into the boarding house's informal family atmosphere, telling stories about life on the ranch that made everyone laugh. But it was the moments after supper that Florence treasured most, when Xavier would ask if she wanted to walk despite the winter cold. They would bundle up in coats and scarves and walk through Marysville's quiet streets, their breath fogging in the air as they talked about everything and nothing. Xavier told her about growing up in Missouri, about coming west on his own at 18 with nothing but what he could carry. Florence found herself opening up about her childhood in Denver, about meeting Thomas at a church social and being charmed by his earnest kindness. "You feel guilty?" Xavier asked one evening as they stood on the bridge over the Yuba River, watching ice form along the banks. "For talking to me, for whatever this is between us," Florence considered the question carefully. "Sometimes, but not as much as I thought I would. Is that terrible?" "No." Xavier's hand found hers in the darkness between them, his bare fingers lacing through her gloved ones. "I think it means you are healing. I think it means you know Thomas would not want you to stop living." She looked up at him, at his face shadowed by the brim of his hat, and felt something bloom in her chest that was neither grief nor guilt but something warmer, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "My aunt says you are saving to buy your own ranch." "I am. I have got almost enough for a down payment on a spread about 10 miles north of here. It is not big, just 160 acres, but the land is good and there is water year-round. I could run cattle, maybe breed horses." He paused, and even in the darkness she could sense his uncertainty. "I have been alone a long time, Florence. I got used to it, thought it was easier that way. But these past weeks, getting to know you, I find myself thinking about what it might be like to have someone to build something with." Florence's heart hammered in her chest. "Xavier, I do not know if I am ready. I am not asking you for anything," he interrupted gently. "I just needed you to know that I am thinking about a future, and when I picture it, you are there. Take all the time you need. I will wait." They walked back to the boarding house in silence, but it was not uncomfortable. When they reached the porch steps, Xavier brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles through the fabric of her glove, a gesture so old-fashioned and courtly that it made her smile despite her tumbling emotions. "Good night, Florence." "Good night, Xavier." She watched him walk away into the darkness, his figure gradually disappearing down the street, and realized with a start that she did not want him to go. The realization frightened her, but it also felt true, solid, something she could hold on to. Christmas came, bringing with it a dusting of fresh snow and a festive atmosphere to Marysville. Catherine decorated the boarding house with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, and there was a general sense of goodwill throughout the town. The mill closed for 2 days, and many of the businesses did the same, allowing families to gather and celebrate. On Christmas Eve, there was a social at the Methodist church, with caroling and hot cider and tables laden with contributed dishes. Florence attended with Catherine, wearing a dress of deep green that her aunt had helped her select, the first non-black garment she had worn since Thomas's death. She felt conspicuous and oddly free, as though she were stepping out of a shadow into uncertain light. Xavier found her soon after they arrived, looking scrubbed and uncomfortable in what were clearly his best clothes: dark trousers, a pressed white shirt, and a string tie. His hair was neatly combed, and without his usual hat, she could see the way it curled at his collar. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and the way he looked at her made Florence believe it was true. They spent the evening together, singing carols though neither of them had particularly good voices, sampling the various dishes, watching the children play games organized by the Sunday school teacher. It felt normal and sweet and entirely wholesome, and yet Florence was acutely aware of Xavier beside her, of the way their hands sometimes brushed accidentally, of the warmth of his body when they stood close. Near the end of the evening, someone produced a fiddle and pushed back the tables to create space for dancing. Xavier extended his hand to Florence with a questioning look, and after only a moment's hesitation, she accepted. The dance was a simple reel, fast-paced and energetic, and Florence found herself laughing as Xavier spun her through the steps with surprising grace. When the dance ended and a slower tune began, Xavier pulled her close for a waltz. His hand was warm on her waist, his other hand holding her securely, and Florence allowed herself to simply feel the moment. The music, the movement, the solid presence of this man who had somehow become essential to her life. "Florence," Xavier said quietly, his mouth near her ear. "I know it has not been long, but I need to tell you something." Her heart jumped into her throat. "What is it?" "I am falling in love with you. I think I started falling the moment I saw you step off that train. And I know you are not ready to hear that, but I could not let another day pass without being honest." Florence missed a step and stumbled slightly, but Xavier caught her easily, holding her steady. She looked up into his blue eyes and saw nothing but sincerity and patience and a tenderness that made her chest ache. "I do not know what I feel," she admitted, her voice barely audible over the music. "Everything is so confused inside me, but Xavier, when I am with you, I feel less lost. I feel like maybe I can find my way back to being whole." "That is enough," he said. "That is more than enough." They danced until the music ended, and then Xavier walked Florence and Catherine home through the quiet, snow-dusted streets. At the boarding house door, he bid them both good night and started to leave, but Florence caught his sleeve. "Xavier, wait." She took a breath, gathering her courage. "Would you come for Christmas dinner tomorrow, as my guest, not just my aunt's?" The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise. "I would be honored." Christmas dinner was a grand affair with all of Catherine's boarders present plus Xavier and 2 other guests who had nowhere else to go. The table groaned under the weight of roasted turkey, ham, potatoes, 3 kinds of vegetables, fresh bread, and 4 different pies. There was laughter and conversation and the warmth of good fellowship, and Florence found herself genuinely happy for the first time since Thomas's death. After dinner, Catherine shooed everyone out of the kitchen, insisting she and her regular boarders could handle the cleaning. Xavier asked Florence if she wanted to walk, and they bundled up against the cold, stepping out into a world transformed by fresh snow that had fallen during dinner. They walked without particular destination, their feet crunching through the pristine white coating. Eventually, they found themselves at the river again, at the bench where Xavier had first told her about his past. The water ran dark and fast, and the mountains in the distance glowed pink with alpenglow. "I have got something for you," Xavier said, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "It is not much, but I wanted you to have it." Florence unwrapped the package with careful fingers, revealing a small carved wooden bird about the size of her palm. It was a sparrow, she thought, rendered in exquisite detail, every feather visible in the smooth wood. "I made it myself," Xavier said, sounding uncertain. "I used to carve when I was a boy, before my father decided it was a waste of time. I started again a few years back, when I needed something to do with my hands in the evenings. When I thought about what to make for you, a bird seemed right, because you flew here to this place to start over." Florence felt tears sting her eyes as she traced the delicate carving with her fingertip. "Xavier, it is beautiful. I do not have anything to give you. You gave me your time. You gave me your company. You gave me hope that I might not spend the rest of my life alone." He reached out and gently wiped away the tear that had escaped down her cheek. "That is more than enough." Florence looked at him standing there in the fading light, this good man who had somehow found his way into her broken heart, and felt the last of her resistance crumble. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and Xavier's arms came around her immediately, holding her close. "I am scared," she whispered against his chest. "I know. So am I." His hand stroked her back, gentle and reassuring. "But being scared does not mean we should not try. It just means what we are building matters enough to be worth the fear." Florence pulled back just enough to look up at him, and what she saw in his face gave her the courage she needed. Rising on her toes, she pressed her lips to his in a kiss that was gentle and tentative and full of promise. Xavier's response was immediate but careful, his mouth moving against hers with restrained passion, one hand coming up to cradle her face. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I am going to do this right," he said. "I am going to court you properly the way you deserve. No rushing, no pressure, just me showing you every day that you can trust me with your heart." "I think I already do," Florence admitted, surprising herself with the truth of it. "I think I have for a while now." They walked back to the boarding house hand in hand, no longer hiding their connection. Catherine took one look at their faces when they came in and smiled knowingly, but she said nothing, just hugged Florence goodnight and sent her upstairs with a whispered, "He is a good one, that Xavier. Hold on to him." That night, Florence placed the carved sparrow on the table beside her bed where she could see it first thing each morning. As she drifted off to sleep, she realized that for the first time since Thomas's death, she was not just surviving. She was beginning to live again. The winter months passed with surprising speed. Florence continued her work at the general store, and Xavier came by the boarding house almost every evening. They fell into a pattern of walks and conversations, of shared meals and quiet moments that deepened their connection. Xavier was true to his word about courting her properly, never pushing for more than she was ready to give, content to let their relationship develop at its own pace. In February, Xavier closed the deal on the ranch he had been saving for, and Florence accompanied him to see it for the first time. They rode out on horseback, Florence on a gentle mare borrowed from the Triple Bar, Xavier on his own horse, a tall bay gelding named Ranger. The ranch was beautiful in a stark winter way, with rolling hills and a creek that wound through the property, bordered by cottonwoods and willows. "The house needs work," Xavier admitted as they stood looking at the small cabin that sat on a rise overlooking the creek. "The roof leaks and the chimney needs repointing, but the bones are solid, and with some effort it could be something really fine." Florence walked around the cabin, peering in the dusty windows, imagining what it could become with care and attention. "How many rooms?" "4." 2 downstairs, 2 up in the loft. There is a good root cellar and a barn that is in better shape than the house." Xavier came to stand beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. "I was thinking if I work hard I could have it fixed up properly by summer." There was something in his voice, an unspoken question, and Florence felt her pulse quicken. "That is not very long." "No, it is not." Xavier turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Florence, I know it has only been a few months, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. I want to build a life with you here on this land. I want to wake up next to you every morning and go to sleep next to you every night. I want to work hard all day knowing I am building something for us, for our future." He paused, his voice roughening with emotion. "Will you marry me?" Florence looked at his dear face, at the hope and love and certainty she saw there, and felt her own certainty rise to meet it. Yes, it had only been a few months. Yes, she had thought she would never love again. But Xavier had shown her that hearts were more resilient than she had known, that it was possible to honor what had been while still embracing what could be. "Yes," she said, and watched joy transform his face. "Yes, I will marry you." Xavier let out a whoop that startled the horses and swept Florence up in his arms, spinning her around until they were both dizzy and laughing. When he set her down, he kissed her with a passion they had both been holding back, and Florence kissed him back with equal fervor, pouring into it all the hope and love and gratitude she felt. They rode back to Marysville in the gathering dusk, riding close enough that their legs brushed, planning their future in excited whispers. They would marry in April, they decided, giving Xavier time to make the cabin habitable and Florence time to prepare. Catherine would help with the wedding, which would be small and simple, just family and close friends. When they announced their engagement at the boarding house that evening, Catherine burst into happy tears and hugged them both fiercely. The other boarders offered congratulations and handshakes, and Mr. Patterson declared that he had known from the start that Xavier and Florence were meant for each other. The next few months passed in a blur of activity. Xavier worked on the cabin every spare moment, repairing the roof, fixing the chimney, replacing rotten boards in the floor, and building new furniture. Florence spent her free time sewing, creating curtains and linens and a beautiful quilt with Catherine's help. She also worked with Mr. Chen to train her replacement at the general store, as she would be moving to the ranch after the wedding. In March, Florence wrote to Thomas's parents in St. Louis, the letter taking days to compose. She told them about Xavier, about how he had helped her heal, about how she thought Thomas would have liked him. Their response came 3 weeks later, warm and supportive, giving their blessing and expressing gratitude that Florence was finding happiness again. April arrived with wildflowers covering the hills around Marysville in carpets of gold and purple. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and warm, and Florence woke in her room at the boarding house for the last time. Catherine helped her dress in a gown they had made together, simple white muslin with lace at the collar and sleeves, and arranged her hair in loose curls pinned with small flowers. "You look beautiful, my dear," Catherine said, her eyes misty. "I am so happy for you." "Thank you for everything," Florence replied, hugging her aunt tight. "If you had not invited me here, if you had not given me a safe place to heal, I would never have found Xavier." The wedding took place at the Methodist church with about 30 guests in attendance. Mr. Harrison from the Triple Bar gave Florence away, and Xavier stood at the front of the church looking handsome and nervous in a new suit. When Florence walked down the aisle toward him, his face lit up with such love and wonder that several women in the congregation sighed audibly. The ceremony was short but meaningful, their vows spoken clearly and with conviction. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier kissed Florence with a tenderness that brought tears to many eyes. The small reception afterward featured cake and punch, music and dancing, and heartfelt toasts to the happy couple. As the afternoon wore on, Xavier and Florence slipped away to begin their journey to the ranch, riding together on Ranger while a wagon with Florence's belongings followed behind. The spring air was soft and sweet, carrying the scent of wildflowers and fresh grass, and Florence felt a contentment she had never expected to know again. The cabin looked transformed from the first time Florence had seen it. Xavier had whitewashed the exterior, repaired the porch, and planted flowers in boxes beneath the windows. Inside, everything was clean and neat, with the furniture he had built arranged carefully and a fire already laid in the stone fireplace. "Welcome home, Mrs. Dalton," Xavier said, carrying Florence over the threshold with ease. "It is perfect," Florence said, looking around at the space that would be theirs. "It is absolutely perfect." That night, they made love for the first time in the bed Xavier had crafted with his own hands, and it was sweet and tender and full of discovery. Xavier was patient and gentle, aware of Florence's nervousness, taking his time to learn what made her gasp and sigh. Florence found herself responding with a passion she had not known she possessed, drawn out by Xavier's loving attention and her own growing confidence. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the quilt Florence had made, Xavier stroking her hair while Florence traced patterns on his chest. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what? For waiting for me, for being patient, for loving me enough to let me heal at my own pace." Xavier tilted her face up so he could see her eyes in the lamplight. "You were worth waiting for. You will always be worth everything." They fell asleep in each other's arms, and Florence's last thought before dreams claimed her was that she had not just survived her grief. She had emerged from it stronger and ready to embrace a new life full of possibility and love. The first months of married life were an adjustment but a joyful one. Florence learned the rhythms of ranch life, rising before dawn to help Xavier with chores, cooking meals on the wood stove, tending a garden she planted near the creek. Xavier hired 2 ranch hands to help with the growing herd of cattle, young men from town who were hardworking and respectful. In the evenings, after the work was done, Florence and Xavier would sit on their porch and watch the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. They would talk about their days, make plans for improvements to the ranch, and sometimes simply sit in comfortable silence, hands linked, grateful for the life they were building together. In June, Florence realized she was pregnant. She told Xavier one evening at dinner, watching his face carefully for his reaction. He was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and Florence felt a flicker of worry. Then he stood up so fast his chair tipped backward, came around the table and lifted her into his arms, tears streaming down his face. "A baby," he kept saying. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Florence asked, though she could clearly see that he was. "Happy does not begin to cover it." Xavier set her down gently, as though she might break, and placed his hand over her still flat stomach. "I never thought I would have this. A family, a real family. You have given me everything, Florence." "We have given each other everything," she corrected, placing her hand over his. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and fall. Xavier became even more protective, insisting Florence rest more and do less heavy work. She protested but secretly appreciated his care, especially as the baby grew and her energy waned. Catherine visited often, bringing supplies and advice, staying for days at a time to help with preserving food from the garden and preparing for the baby's arrival. In December, almost exactly a year after Florence had first arrived in Marysville, she went into labor. Xavier rode to town for the midwife, Mrs. Patterson, while Catherine stayed with Florence, timing the pains and offering encouragement. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day, but finally, as snow began to fall outside the cabin windows, Florence gave birth to a healthy baby boy. "He is perfect," Xavier breathed, holding his son for the first time with shaking hands. "Florence, he is absolutely perfect." They named him William after Xavier's grandfather, the one good man in his father's family. William had his mother's hazel eyes and his father's dark hair, and from the first moment he wrapped his tiny hand around Xavier's finger, he owned his parents' hearts completely. As Florence recovered from childbirth, lying in bed with William nursing contentedly at her breast, she watched Xavier sitting in the chair he had made, staring at his son with an expression of absolute wonder. She thought about the broken woman who had stepped off the train into the snow a year ago, the woman who had thought she would never be whole again, and marveled at how wrong she had been. "What are you thinking?" Xavier asked, noticing her gaze. "That I love you. That I am grateful for every moment that brought me here, even the painful ones, because they led to this. To us. To him." She looked down at William's small face, feeling her heart expand with a love she had not known existed. Xavier rose and came to sit on the edge of the bed, putting his arm around Florence and looking down at their son. "Do you remember what I said the day you arrived? That I knew you would come, that I felt it. I remember. I thought you were strange," he laughed softly. "I probably was. But I meant it. It was like something in me recognized something in you even before we spoke. Like I had been waiting my whole life without knowing what I was waiting for, and then there you were." "Do you think it was fate?" Florence asked. "That we were meant to find each other?" "I do not know about fate, but I know I will be grateful for the rest of my life that you were brave enough to get on that train, that you chose to keep living even when it was hard. I know I will spend every day trying to be worthy of the gift you have given me." "You already are," Florence said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "You already are." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the ranch in white, muffling all sound and creating a sense of peace and stillness. Inside the warm cabin, the small family stayed close together. Xavier and Florence and baby William, bound by love and hope, and the knowledge that sometimes the hardest journeys lead to the most beautiful destinations. The years that followed were good ones, filled with hard work and simple pleasures. The ranch prospered under Xavier's careful management, the herd growing steadily as he developed a reputation for breeding quality cattle. Florence proved to have a gift for managing the business side of the operation, keeping meticulous records and handling correspondence with buyers throughout California and beyond. William grew into a sturdy, curious child with his father's easy smile and his mother's thoughtful nature. When he was 2, Florence became pregnant again, and this time delivered a daughter they named Margaret, after Florence's mother. 2 years after that came another son, James, named for Catherine's late husband. The cabin was expanded to accommodate the growing family, with Xavier and his hands building on a proper second story with 3 bedrooms and enlarging the kitchen. Catherine moved out to the ranch permanently when the children were small, occupying one of the upstairs rooms and helping with their care. She proved to be a doting grandmother figure, always ready with stories and treats and endless patience. On winter evenings, the family would gather around the fireplace, Xavier carving small animals for the children while Florence read aloud from the books they ordered from San Francisco. William would sit at his father's feet, collecting the small carved creatures and inventing elaborate games with them. Margaret would curl up in Catherine's lap, and baby James would sleep in a cradle Xavier had made, rocking gently as Florence pushed it with her foot. These were the moments Florence treasured most, the ordinary evenings that made up a life. She would look around the warm room at the faces she loved and think about the journey that had brought her here, about the grief that had threatened to destroy her, but had instead transformed her into someone stronger, someone capable of embracing joy without forgetting sorrow. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Xavier took Florence back to the spot by the Marysville train station where they had first met. The town had grown considerably, with new buildings and streets, but the station remained largely unchanged. "You remember standing here?" Xavier asked, taking her hand. "You looked so lost and so brave at the same time. I remember you leaning against that post, looking at me like you knew something I did not." Florence smiled at the memory. "I thought you were strange." "I was strange. I am still strange." Xavier pulled her close, right there in public, and kissed her soundly. "But you love me anyway." "I do," Florence agreed, resting her head on his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I absolutely do." They stood together as snow began to fall, light flakes that caught in Florence's hair and on Xavier's coat shoulders, echoing that long-ago December day when everything had changed. But now, instead of carrying grief and uncertainty, Florence felt only gratitude and love and the deep contentment of knowing she was exactly where she was meant to be. "I knew you would come," Xavier murmured, repeating the words he had said 5 years earlier. "I felt it." "And I came," Florence replied, tilting her face up to kiss him. "And I am still here, and I will always be here." As they walked back toward the wagon that would carry them home to the ranch, to the children and Catherine and the life they had built together, Florence thought about how grief had brought her to Marysville, but love had given her a reason to stay. She thought about Thomas, sending him a silent thank you for the time they had shared and the lessons he had taught her about loving with an open heart. And she thought about Xavier, this unexpected gift, this man who had seen past her grief to the woman she could become, and had waited patiently while she found her way back to life. The years continued to pass with their mixture of joy and challenge, triumph and setback, the texture of a full life lived with purpose and love. William grew tall and strong, taking to ranch life with enthusiasm, riding before he was 5 and helping his father with the cattle as soon as he was old enough. Margaret proved to have her grandmother Catherine's gift for healing, always tending to injured animals, and showing a gentle competence that suggested she might become a nurse or even a doctor, if such things were possible for women in California. Young James was the family wild card, full of mischief and energy, keeping everyone on their toes with his elaborate pranks and boundless curiosity. He kept the household lively, and both Xavier and Florence agreed that he would probably either become a great success or give them gray hair by the time he was grown, possibly both. When William was 12, Xavier began teaching him the business of running the ranch in earnest, taking him along to cattle sales and letting him participate in decisions about breeding and range management. Florence started teaching Margaret the bookkeeping, showing her how to track expenses and income, how to negotiate with buyers, how to spot a bad deal before committing to it. Even young James, at 8, had his responsibilities, helping his mother in the garden and learning to care for the chickens and pigs. Catherine, now in her 70s, remained a vital presence in the household, though she moved more slowly and tired more easily. She spent her days knitting, tending a small herb garden, and regaling the children with stories of the gold rush days and their parents' courtship. Florence would sometimes find Xavier sitting with Catherine on the porch, just talking quietly, and her heart would swell with love for this man who had embraced her family as his own. In the spring of 1886, 10 years after Florence had first arrived in Marysville, Xavier and Florence took a trip alone together for the first time since their honeymoon, leaving the children in Catherine's capable care. They traveled north to see some land. Xavier was considering purchasing to expand the ranch's grazing territory. The land was beautiful, rolling hills with good grass and ample water, and Florence could see the potential immediately. But what made the trip memorable was not the land itself, but the time they had alone together, away from the demands of children and ranch work. They stayed in a small hotel in the nearby town, making love with the freedom of knowing they would not be interrupted, talking late into the night about their dreams and hopes for the future. "You ever regret it?" Florence asked one evening as they lay in bed, Xavier's arm around her shoulders. "Taking on a widow with all her grief and baggage, your life would have been simpler without me." Xavier propped himself up on one elbow to look down at her, his expression serious. "Florence Dalton, in the 10 years we have been together, you have never said anything more foolish. Simpler, maybe. But simple is not the same as good. You and the children are the best thing that ever happened to me. Everything I have done, everything I have built, it means something because I am building it for us, for our family." "I love you," Florence said, pulling him down for a kiss. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes." "Good," Xavier replied against her lips, "because I love you exactly that much, and I would hate to be the only one terrified by the depth of it." They bought the land, and Xavier spent the summer working with his hands to build a line camp on the property, where he and William could stay during roundups. Florence visited often, bringing supplies and staying for days at a time, and she came to love the wild beauty of the northern range almost as much as she loved the home ranch. As the years moved toward the 1890s, the ranch became one of the most successful operations in Yuba County. Xavier's reputation for honest dealing and quality livestock brought buyers from as far away as San Diego and even Arizona. The family prospered, though neither Xavier nor Florence ever forgot what it was like to struggle, to count every penny and work until exhaustion. They made sure their children understood the value of hard work and fair dealing. That success was not just about making money, but about building something lasting and treating people right. William, now approaching adulthood, had already declared his intention to take over the ranch when Xavier was ready to step back. Margaret was set to attend a nursing school in Sacramento, one of the first such programs to accept women in California. And James, still young but already showing promise, talked about becoming a veterinarian, having developed a gift for working with animals. Catherine passed peacefully in her sleep in the winter of 1892, just shy of her 80th birthday. The whole family mourned her deeply, but Florence especially felt the loss of the woman who had given her refuge when she needed it most, who had encouraged her to open her heart to Xavier, who had been there for every important moment of her children's lives. They buried Catherine in the small cemetery outside Marysville, and Florence placed wildflowers on the grave throughout that spring and summer, talking to her aunt about the children and the ranch, and how grateful she was for everything Catherine had given her. "I hope you know how much you changed my life," Florence whispered during one visit, kneeling beside the grave marker. "I hope you can see how happy we are, how the family you helped create is thriving. Thank you for never giving up on me, even when I had given up on myself." Xavier found her there as the sun was setting, and he helped her to her feet, holding her as she cried for the woman who had been a second mother to her. They stood together in the gathering dusk, finding comfort in each other as they had so many times before. And Florence thought about how grief never truly disappeared but rather changed shape, becoming something you could carry alongside joy and love and all the other emotions that made up a full life. As the 19th century drew toward its close, Florence would sometimes stand on her porch and look out at the land they had built their life on, marveling at how far they had come. She was 41 years old now, with streaks of gray in her hair and lines around her eyes that came from years of squinting into the sun. Xavier, at 43, still moved with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his body, though his dark hair was liberally salted with silver and his face bore the weathering of decades outdoors. But they were happy, genuinely and deeply happy in a way Florence had once thought impossible. The ranch was thriving, their children were healthy and growing into capable adults, and the love between Florence and Xavier had only deepened with time, becoming something solid and permanent, a foundation upon which everything else was built. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised Florence by taking her back to the spot where he had proposed, the rise overlooking the creek where the old cabin still stood, now used as housing for their ranch hands. He had arranged for the children to stay with a neighboring family so they could spend the day alone together. They rode out in the early morning, the April air sweet with the scent of wildflowers and new grass. When they reached the spot, Florence saw that Xavier had prepared a picnic, with a blanket spread out and a basket of food waiting. "I wanted to show you something," Xavier said after they had eaten, pulling a wooden box from his saddlebag. He handed it to Florence, and when she opened it, she found it filled with small carved animals, hundreds of them, each one unique and beautifully detailed. "Xavier, these are beautiful, but I do not understand. I carved one for every day of the first year we were married," he explained. "I wanted to mark each day, to remember how blessed I felt to wake up next to you. After that first year, I kept carving, but I stopped counting. I just carved when I felt grateful, when I wanted to mark a moment as special." He reached into the box and pulled out a small carved sparrow, identical to the one he had given her that first Christmas. "And I thought, on our 20th anniversary, maybe it was time to give them to you." Florence's vision blurred with tears as she looked at the contents of the box, at this tangible record of their life together. There must be thousands of them, not quite, but close. Xavier took her hand, his thumb rubbing over her wedding ring. "Every single one represents a moment when I thought about how lucky I am to have found you, to have been brave enough to talk to you that day at the train station, to have been patient enough to wait while you healed. Florence, you are the best thing that ever happened to me, and I wanted you to know that I have never, not for a single day, taken you for granted." Florence set the box aside carefully and launched herself into Xavier's arms, kissing him with all the passion and love and gratitude she felt. They made love there on the blanket under the spring sky, with the sound of the creek murmuring nearby and birds singing in the cottonwoods, their bodies moving together with the practiced ease of long familiarity, but also with the tenderness of first love. Afterward, lying tangled together with Xavier's coat spread over them both, Florence said, "Do you remember that day by the river when you told me you were falling in love with me, at the Christmas dance? I remember everything about our time together. Every conversation, every look, every moment. I was so scared that night. Scared of betraying Thomas's memory, scared of getting hurt again, scared of feeling anything at all. But you were so patient, so steady. You gave me space to figure out what I wanted and time to understand that loving you did not mean forgetting him." Xavier propped himself up to look at her, his blue eyes intense. "I was terrified you would never be ready, that you would always see me as just a friend. But I also knew I would wait as long as it took, even if it meant waiting forever, because some things are worth any amount of patience." "I am glad you did not have to wait forever," Florence said, tracing the line of his jaw with her finger. "I am glad I found the courage to choose life, to choose love, to choose you. "We chose each other," Xavier corrected, "and I choose you again every single day." They rode back to the ranch as the sun was setting, the box of carved animals carefully packed in Xavier's saddlebag. When they arrived home, the children had returned and were waiting on the porch, eager to hear about their parents' day. Florence and Xavier shared a look over their heads, a look that communicated everything they needed to say. Gratitude, love, contentment, and the deep satisfaction of a life well lived together. The years continued to roll forward with their steady rhythm of seasons and celebrations, challenges and triumphs. William married a girl from a neighboring ranch and built a house on the far edge of the property, becoming a full partner in the ranch operation. Margaret completed her nursing training and returned to Marysville, opening a small clinic that served the surrounding community. James, true to his childhood dreams, went east to study veterinary medicine, returning with his degree and a quiet determination to improve animal care throughout the county. Xavier and Florence became grandparents multiple times over as William and his wife had 4 children, and Margaret eventually married a fellow nurse and had 3 more. The main house, expanded yet again, became the center of a growing family network, with Sunday dinners that could include 20 people or more. Florence, now in her 50s, took on the role of family matriarch with grace, organizing gatherings and maintaining connections, making sure no one felt forgotten or left out. Xavier, still vital despite his advancing years, continued to work the ranch alongside William, though he was content now to let his son handle more of the day-to-day decisions. On quiet evenings, Florence and Xavier would sit on their porch as they had done for decades, watching the sun set over the land they had built their life on. They would hold hands and talk about the children and grandchildren, about repairs needed to the barn, about the upcoming cattle sale, about everything and nothing. "You ever think about that first day?" Florence asked one evening, the question coming out of comfortable silence. "When I stepped off the train and you were waiting there, all the time," Xavier admitted. "I think about how close we came to never meeting, all the things that had to happen just right to bring us to that moment. If your aunt had come to meet you herself, if I had been busy with something else, if you had arrived a day earlier or later. But none of those things happened. We were both there at exactly the right moment." Florence squeezed his hand. "Do you still believe what you said? That you felt I would come?" Xavier was quiet for a moment, considering. "I believe I felt something that day, a rightness I could not explain. Whether that was fate or coincidence or just dumb luck, I do not know. But I know I have spent every day since being grateful for it." "Me too," Florence said softly. "Even the hard days, even the times I was scared or doubting or struggling, I have never regretted saying yes to you." "That is all a man can ask for," Xavier replied. "To be chosen and to keep being chosen day after day." They sat together as the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky. 2 people who had found each other at the right moment and had built something lasting and true. The ranch was quiet around them, the children and grandchildren in their own homes, the cattle settled for the night, everything peaceful and right. As they finally rose to go inside, Xavier pulled Florence close one more time, kissing her with the tenderness of long love. "I knew you would come," he whispered against her lips, repeating the words he had said so long ago. "I felt it." "And I came," Florence whispered back, completing the ritual they had created, "and I stayed, and I will always stay." They walked into the house together, hands linked, ready for whatever the future might bring, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges came, they would face them together, as they had faced everything for the past 4 decades. The door closed behind them and the porch was left empty, a testament to the countless evenings they had spent there, building a life one conversation, one sunset, one shared moment at a time. The turn of the century brought changes to California and to Marysville, but the Dalton Ranch remained a constant, a place where family gathered and traditions were maintained. Florence and Xavier, now in their 60s, gradually stepped back from the day-to-day operations, content to let William run things with James's help, while Margaret maintained her medical practice in town. Florence spent more time with her grandchildren, teaching them to read and do figures, telling them stories about the old days and their grandfather's courage in pursuing her despite her grief. She showed them the carved sparrow that Xavier had given her that first Christmas, now kept in a place of honor on her dresser, and explained what it meant about choosing to fly even when you were afraid. Xavier continued to carve, his hands not as steady as they once were, but his eye for detail as sharp as ever. He made toys for the grandchildren and small gifts for Florence, marking anniversaries and special moments with the same attention he had given to documenting their first years together. In the spring of 1904, Florence woke one morning to find Xavier already up and dressed, standing at the bedroom window looking out at the ranch as the sun rose. She joined him, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind and resting her cheek against his back. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About how blessed I have been, about how every good thing in my life started the day you stepped off that train." He turned in her arms to face her, his weathered face creased with a smile. "About how I have loved you for 28 years and it still does not feel like enough time." "We have many more years ahead of us," Florence assured him, though she knew that at their age, such promises were harder to make with certainty. "I hope so. But whether we have years or decades, I want to make sure you know that you made my life complete. You took a lonely, hard man and taught him how to love, how to be part of a family, how to build something that would last beyond himself." Florence reached up to cup his face in her hands, looking into the blue eyes that still had the power to make her heart skip. "And you took a broken woman and showed her that healing was possible, that love did not have to be about replacing what was lost, but about opening yourself to something new. You gave me a reason to live again, Xavier. You gave me everything." They stood together in the golden light of dawn, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and had created a life neither could have imagined. Outside, the ranch was waking up, grandchildren's voices calling to each other, cattle lowing, the familiar sounds of a new day beginning. And as Florence and Xavier finally made their way downstairs to join the family gathering for breakfast, they walked hand in hand, as they had done for nearly 3 decades, still choosing each other, still grateful for the miracle of that snowy December day when a grief-stricken widow had stepped off a train, and a lonely cowboy had been brave enough to say he had been waiting. The years after that continued in their gentle progression, with summers spent watching the grandchildren learn to ride and rope, winters spent gathered around fires telling stories, springs full of new calves and garden planting, autumns dedicated to harvest and preparation for the cold months ahead. Florence and Xavier aged gracefully together, their hair turning completely silver, their movements slower but their love undiminished. Florence passed peacefully in her sleep in the winter of 1912, at the age of 59, having lived a full and happy life. Xavier mourned her deeply, but without the desperate edge of someone who had been denied their time together. They had had 36 years, and every one of them had been a gift. He continued to carve even after her death, making small sparrows that he placed on her grave when he visited, dozens of them eventually, all taking flight in her memory. He lived another 8 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren who loved him, working the ranch until the very end, determined to honor the life he and Florence had built together. When Xavier Dalton died in the spring of 1920, he was buried next to Florence under a cottonwood tree on the rise above the creek where he had proposed to her so many years before. William made sure they had a simple but beautiful stone marker that read, Xavier and Florence Dalton. He waited for her. She came. They built a life. The ranch continued under William's management and eventually passed to his children and then to theirs, remaining in the family for generations. The story of how Xavier and Florence met, of the cowboy who somehow knew his love would arrive on a snowy December day, became family legend, told and retold at gatherings, embellished slightly with each telling but always maintaining its essential truth. That sometimes love comes when you least expect it, that healing is possible even after devastating loss, and that being brave enough to say yes to life, to connection, to vulnerability, can transform everything. And somewhere in the main house, carefully preserved under glass, sits a small carved sparrow, its wings spread as though in flight, a testament to the woman who was brave enough to leave her grief behind and the man who was patient enough to wait for her to arrive.